Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 1st, 1859, militant abolitionist John Brown awaits his execution. He would be hanged by the Commonwealth of Virginia the next morning, December 2nd, for treason, murder, and insurrection. Brown, as you may know, had led a raid on the town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, earlier that fall in October. He led 18 recruits, 13 white men and 5 black men, in an effort to seize weapons and spark an anti-slavery insurrection. The raid was successful at the very beginning and then very quickly not successful. Troops descended, killed many of Brown's men. Brown was captured, tried, and pretty quickly sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, John Brown wrote a famous letter in which he famously said, quote, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." 16 months later, the country was in civil war. So lots to discuss about John Brown, his death, his life, his political context, his story through the years. And here, as always, to do it is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
So let's start, since it's our hook, with his death and his hanging, and then we'll kind of go backwards in time a little bit to the raid and his political context and his biography. But I just find some of the details about the hanging of John Brown so fascinating, including this one, which is just sort of an image I can't get out of my mind since I first read it. But he was transported from the jail to the gallows, and he rode in a wagon sitting atop his own casket on the way to the gallows. And then in the audience at the hanging were, among other people, Stonewall Jackson, John Wilkes Booth, and Walt Whitman, who wrote a number of poems about John Brown. And even at the time, John Brown was someone people were writing lots of poems about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most cinematic moment. And I think it's important to note that it was meant to be a cinematic moment. It's something that John Brown understood was that up until the moment that he died, he was delivering a message to the country about slavery. And it's so interesting, those 3 men that you mentioned that were in the audience, these are 3 men who have a lot of influence on American history in the years going forward. And you can imagine that for them, it is a seminal moment as well, particularly John Wilkes Booth and Stonewall Jackson, who will both serve in the cause of the Confederacy in the war that starts, as you mentioned, just a year and a half later.
Yeah, and that's, to me, I mean, one of the things, we can get to this later, but these swirling questions about martyrdom versus action in life. And, I think this fundamental question about whether John Brown saw himself as someone who's going to affect change or someone who was going to turn himself into a martyr. And he certainly, when I think he had been captured and was awaiting death, tried to play up, as you're saying, some of these cinematic details, knowing that the story of John Brown and his martyrdom would have an effect for a long time to come. And it certainly did. But let's maybe then go back to the raid itself. So people may not know the story of Harper's Ferry and the raid that John Brown led. I will tell you that I grew up not that far from Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and this was on the high school trip circuit. And so I've been to Harper's Ferry a couple times. It is quite beautiful. It's one of these places where you can kind of tell that it's like just because of the geography and topography, like it strikes you as strategic, right? Like there was an armory there. It was a Confederate base, but there's like a river going through it. There's a railroad going through it. You can see like, okay, I can see why John Brown, when he wanted to lead this raid, saw this as an important target. But what else do we need to know about the kind of rationale for John Brown leading this band of men into Harper's Ferry, Virginia?
So the thing that John Brown wanted to do was he wanted to trigger a slave insurrection. He wanted enslaved people to see this as a moment of rising up against slavery and the institution of slavery in the South. And he thought that if he could take this armory, if he could bring together a biracial group of men in order to trigger this move toward abolition, that it was all it was going to take for enslaved people to rise up and throw off their shackles. What was interesting is that not only was this a very optimistic and maybe kind of naive approach to the end of slavery, but it was the very kind of thing that men like Stonewall Jackson and John Wilkes Booth feared. And in the century leading up to this moment in the United States, the fear of slave insurrection, of enslaved people rising up and killing white people, had been one of those conspiracy theories that just constantly circled around in the South. And this was sort of, for many white Southerners, confirmation that all of their fears were true, that these abolitionists were coming to kill them all.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I feel like that doesn't get told in the story of the run up to the Civil War. It seems like this inevitable clash between the North and the South, and this version of a Civil War that is much more about small insurrections throughout the South, asymmetric warfare or whatever you want to call it. That doesn't really come up. And I think it's interesting. I mean, and I think it's, again, this tension in John Brown's story between the sort of thing he's doing at a given moment and the goals there versus these larger goals. And so I think he genuinely felt like he could actually arm some slaves and free them in Harper's Ferry and achieve something there. But then I think he always had this eye towards the legacy, the spark, as you were describing.
Right. And he had helped enslaved people reach freedom before in the past. On his way to Harper's Ferry, helped to free enslaved people. He had been part of the Underground Railroad in the decades earlier. So he had some experience with this flight from slavery to freedom. And so you can understand, like, he's deeply rooted in this movement and believes that it can spark something much, much bigger. But I think that there was an earnestness to him. Obviously, earnest is almost too light of a word to describe him. But I think a bit of naivete as well. Yeah,
and a streak of violence, right? I mean, just to sort of describe this raid, it ends up being incredibly bloody. But he believed in violence as a tactic, but it doesn't really work in this situation. For one, a number of Black Americans in Harper's Ferry don't take up the arms that he frees. And then, as I said, the insurrection is very quickly squashed and a bunch of people die. But on that question of violence as a tactic and thinking of him in the context of an abolition movement, we think of abolitionism as this, like, I don't know if it's genteel is the right word, but we think of it as a sort of intellectual pursuit, often in the North. Was he representing us a kind of through line of violence and abolition that we don't really acknowledge as much as we should?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we really mischaracterize abolitionism as we think about it as a nonviolent movement. There certainly were people who were opposed to the use of violence, and there were people like Frederick Douglass who did not want anyone joining with John Brown because they thought that everyone was just going to get themselves killed, which point to Frederick Douglass. But the use of violence as a political tool for abolitionists, particularly Black abolitionists, was something that had a decades-long tradition at this point because they fundamentally understood that slavery was a violent system and that it wasn't going to be peaceably unwound. You had more than 20 to 30 years of sort of quote unquote peaceful abolitionism where you had speeches and you had rallies and you had writings and all of these exhortations that people just give up slavery. And it didn't work. And in fact, by the time that Harper's Ferry rolls around, the U.S. was already at war. Like, there had been a war going on in Kansas, a civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. So violence was already something that was happening. And if we try to make what happened with John Brown something exceptional, we're missing the fact that slavery was fundamentally a violent institution, but that the politics had already turned pretty violent much earlier on.
And you mentioned the Kansas skirmishes or clashes, what's often known as Bleeding Kansas. John Brown was involved in that as well, and actually his involvement there plays a big part in his kind of reputation, I think, at the time, and certainly through history. And he's involved in a particular incident that is incredibly bloody, in which a number of families are killed. And I think that over the years, that incident in particular, and then Harper's Ferry as well, have been used to paint this picture of John Brown as bloody, crazed. You actually use that phrase wild-eyed, which I don't think there's anyone in American history who gets called wild-eyed more than John Brown. I almost, in my head, I just think of John Brown and wild-eyed are the same thing. And actually, maybe it's just I'm projecting, but when you look at pictures of him, you kind of see that. And Ethan Hawke is now playing him in a series, I think has captured the eyes nicely. So, I mean, wild-eyed is this thing, but it does tell so much about this particular idea of John Brown as not just passionate, but crazed.
Yeah, and I would use a different word to describe him, which is sort of like fervent. You talked earlier about how these ideas of martyrdom, and he's often been portrayed as like a Christ-like figure, but he wasn't necessarily that religious of a person. He belonged to a church. He belonged to the Free Church in Massachusetts, which was one of these centers of abolitionist speech and organizing. But he didn't have like a pastor at his hanging. And I think that the religion, the spiritual fire inside John Brown, starting as early as the 1830s, was this idea that he could play a pivotal role in ending slavery in the United States. And that becomes, in many ways, his life's mission.
Right. And I mean, he does employ language, as you're saying. He does sort of employ language that gives you a sense that he felt like he was on a mission from God, which I think probably adds to this idea of him as maniacal or fervent. Then he also does reject a lot of the institutions of religion, which in many cases were pro-slavery. So he has this very interesting relationship with religion. But, I do want to track a little bit as we start to wrap up the way in which John Brown and the various ways he's been described through the years. So I think at the time, people had an understanding of him. I think a lot of his fellow abolitionists truly respected him. A lot of the people you mentioned earlier say, he's a genuine abolitionist and a genuine ally. Over the years, I think this idea of him as more maniacal, more fervent, more wild-eyed, and then even this creeping idea of John Brown as a domestic terrorist, which you start to hear a little bit of that language employed, has crept up. As we've noticed so much in this podcast, it's the kind of like thinking of the current moment that often influences how you see a historical figure. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about kind of how John Brown has been seen through the years and how that has reflected different ideas about slavery and abolition and so forth.
This is a fascinating ripple of American history that somebody like John Brown, who in any other situation would have been seen as like a John the Baptist figure, because he is involved in this raid on the eve of the Civil War. He's on the winning side, the abolition of slavery. But because in the United States, pretty quickly after the Civil War, you have the reassertion of the power of the white South and this attempt really to rewrite history, not just in the South, but across the United States, that the people who were too fervently anti-slavery were, in fact, a little crazy. And that even the attempts after the Civil War to enfranchise Black men and to have multiracial rule in the South, that was all a terrible experiment. And so white supremacy reasserts itself, and John Brown becomes, instead of this sort of hero, becomes this crazed figure that we know about. And then over time, the domestic terrorist thing is wild, right? Because again, he's on the winning side. He's on the side that now everyone agrees is the right side. I think that the transformation that we talk about today is so interesting. I think there's a pretty broad rejection, not a wholesale, but a pretty broad rejection of those older interpretations of him. But there is a really interesting conversation happening now about rejecting the white savior narrative that John Brown often appears in. Yeah. And that sort of tussling over how prominent he should be in the stories that we tell about abolition. I find those absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm springing this on you, so you may not actually know, but I mean, I feel like I've seen John Brown brought up even kind of like alongside like Timothy McVeigh as like true believers who were willing to martyr themselves for their cause through any violent means necessary, which, you know, think about how perverted that is. But I think it tells you so much about kind of how malleable his legacy has become.
I think that goes directly to the sort of respectability politics and the myth of nonviolence as like the one true form of politics and how strong that is. Timothy McVeigh was a white power activist who killed hundreds of innocent people, and to conflate him with an abolitionist by saying that just like all violence is bad and therefore these two men are the same.
Oh, or I'm even thinking the other way, like people who are kind of defending McVeigh or sort of saying like, you know, these were two freedom fighters, right, in a legacy of freedom fighters. Both are pretty perverted.
I reject that too.
Yes. Just to be clear.
I reject any comparison of those two men. But I think it gets to a more interesting issue, which is there is this pretty strong strain in American politics that any violence is fundamentally wrong and spoils the cause. And the thing that we see with abolitionism and the lead up to the Civil War is it's a lot trickier than that. And Black abolitionists relied on violence as well. And our friend Kelly Carter Jackson, who's been on the show a few times, has written a really great book about this called Force and Freedom that really challenges that notion that all violence must be rejected out of hand.
You know, and I think our understanding of the role of violence and the role of insurrection is growing more and more. I mean, I think, you know, slave revolts are something that I think until fairly recently haven't been part of the conversation around anti-slavery movements. Certainly like Haiti's slave rebellion, I think, is something that people haven't talked about. And these are all connected, and I think it's part of a growing conversation. And John Brown certainly fits into that in the ways you're describing.
And John Brown saw Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the revolution in Haiti, as somebody to look up to. Here was somebody who led not just an insurrection, but a revolution, who brought freedom to Haiti and ended slavery in Haiti and set up Black rule in Haiti. And that Haiti was a model for many abolitionists, particularly Black abolitionists, of what was possible.
Yeah, and then one of my favorite parts of this whole story is that the inspiration goes both ways, because one of the main roads in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, is actually named after John Brown. So I think it shows how much this was all connected and how much the influence ran across all the different struggles in lots of different countries. I want to get back a little bit to John Brown's legacy and the way he's depicted over time, because there's this interesting thing happening now, and we'll confess that neither of us have seen this Showtime series that has Ethan Hawke in it that's out now about John Brown. I'm very much looking forward to watching it. I've heard it's quite good. I have talked to a few people who've seen it who say that there's this kind of interesting portrayal of John Brown in there almost as like a naive, bumbling ally, like sort of overwoke white guy, which is, I think, a kind of interesting reflection on the politics we're having around race right now. And so I think, again, he continues to be this blank canvas on which a lot of the sort of contemporary thinking about race comes to the surface.
And I think that's why the history here is really important, because there is an element of that to him. I think it's also important to understand that Black abolitionists allied with John Brown and saw him not just as like this bumbling idiot who wandered into their circles, but he worked closely with Harriet Tubman. There was a Black abolitionist woman who was the biggest funder of John Brown's endeavors. So it wasn't that he was just, you know, oh, I heard slavery is a bad thing.
Totally.
Let's get rid of that. He was much more knitted into these networks than the sort of maybe the contemporary version of him allows for.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to point out. I mean, you know, his contemporaries, Tubman, I think, is quoted as saying she thought Brown was the greatest white man who ever lived. Douglass called him a brave and glorious man. I think even Malcolm X said that white people could not join his organization of Afro-American unity, but if John Brown was still alive, then he would be the only white guy who'd be able to join. So yes, I think it's important to point out how his peers saw him and how, you know, and that legacy too. All right, we're going to leave it there. I do want to sneak in one also on this day, especially because it fits in so nicely, and we've talked about this before, but this was the day in 1955 where Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. I mean, talk about another story that has been a little sanitized, where some of maybe the violent edges have been taken off a bit, and a little less of understanding of the kind of real hard work that went into the moment we all remember. I think that Rosa Parks story, kind of echoes a lot of the same things we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and folks should go back and listen to our conversation with Daniel McGuire, where we get into Rosa Parks' legacy.
Totally. That was one of my favorite ones that we've done so far. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independently produced, listener-supported shows. If you would like to support the show, it's getting towards the end of the year. I've been saying this more and more, but if you are starting to think about some of your charitable giving, supporting some of the things that have maybe helped you get through 2020, or just make stuff that you like and you are able to do so, you can support this show directly by going to thisdaypod.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Get in touch with any questions or comments about the show or any suggestions for future topics. We're doing a few listener suggestions coming up in the next few episodes, so keep those coming. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. Keep the ratings and reviews coming on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to the show. Spread the word, do all that, or just come back and listen next episode. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.